Hello, everyone. I hope you're all okay and settled into the nanodegree now. It's been almost 2 months now. I would like to welcome you to our ninth content webinar. This week, we won't be talking about some intricate concepts like we did in the previous weeks. Um, we're not going to talk about anything related to JavaScript, HTML, or CSS. Instead, we'll take a look at a way that we can enhance our development process. And knowing all these details and detailed stuff about JavaScript that we've looked at in the previous weeks as well. But what about making our lives a bit easier? Um, I'm sure you've now gone through setting up a project at least once in your studies, and if you haven't, that's okay. I'm sure you'll get to have to set up a project soon. So setting up a project is a kind of repetitive task every time you have to go through another project, and it would be awesome if there is some kind of way that we can automatically do this. So not have to set up the project every single time doing exactly the same stuff. And there's actually a way we can do it. And today we'll look at one of those ways. We're programmers, right? I mean, you can think of ways to automate certain tasks in our software. That's why we write our code. Well, it turns out that we can also automate this boring setup. So with the use of a software called a build tool, we will be able to automate the nasty setup procedures and save ourselves some valuable time for coding later on. Um, Before we get into that, though, I would like to congratulate all of you that have managed to finish developing the third project. Um, you should be very proud of yourselves, as always. Um, and for those that have not quite finished yet, there's still 2 days until the deadline. Now's the time to step on the gas and finish that last part of the code that's missing. Just a reminder that on Sunday, the 12th of May, this is the deadline for the project. So if you need any help with it, don't hesitate to message me at any time. I'm here, and I'll try to help with all my skills. So let's begin the presentation. I will be sending this to you along with a few resources and the coding demos that we'll try to take a look at if we have enough time. Okay, so let's flip to the presentation. Just a second. And there it is. Here you can see our topic, Gulp setup and usage. And here is our agenda. Firstly, we'll start with the concept of flow. This is a very important concept that all developers must take into consideration, because in addition to providing a product that seamlessly flows as a user interacts with it, we can benefit ourselves from designing a workflow that is nice and intuitive. So if we have a development process that simply flows from one task to another, this will make our lives much more easier and our coding much more fun and productive. Next up, we'll take a look at what web tooling is in general, what it means, what is its goal, and we'll look at some of the most important popular web tools out there and explain what they do and what they're used for. Also, we'll make a comparison of the two most famous ones, and hopefully you'll get a better idea of which one you'd like to use. for your own. After that, when we know what web tools are, we'll get into what build tools constitute. So, build tools are a part of web tools. Just so you know, these are the tools that almost all professional developers use to automate parts of their workflow, which are repetitive and save time for writing actual code. So no one likes to waste time on the boring setup process, and using build tools, we can automate this setup process. Next, we'll look at the two most popular web tools out there for front-end developers. That's Grunt and Gulp. We'll list some of their characteristics, make a comparison between them, and choose our favorite one. Just so you know, we're gonna choose Gulp, of course, as you may have noticed. You're free to use whatever you want. We'll just go through Gulp here and now. Um, we'll talk a bit about what Gulp is, and after that, we'll see how to get it running on our computers. And that's all there is to this webinar this week. It's not too hard. We're not going to talk about intricate concepts. It's just how to set up this process, and after that, it's up to you to discover how to set up your uh, development environment to suit yourselves best. Finally, we'll take a look at some of the resources, and once we do that, if there is enough time, I'll end the presentation and try to set up Gulp on my own computer to give you kind of a live demonstration of how that's done. Okay, so let's begin. First, we'll start off by explaining what the concept of flow is. Now, bear in mind that the concept of flow has nothing to do with any programming language or software in general. We're not talking about anything computer related here. This is just a psychological concept which we can use in our day-to-day work to make the process a bit more enjoyable, a bit more intuitive, and fun in the end, because um, we all think that coding is fun, and it's supposed to be fun if you're going to do it all of your life, essentially. So, um, if you introduce the concept of flow, you'll get much more out of it. Um, Here, I have provided a sample definition which I got from the web. And as we can see, flow is a state of mind, first and foremost. So bear this in mind. Flow is a state of mind. Um, it is the mental state of operation in which a person performing an activity is fully immersed in a feeling of energized focus, full involvement, and enjoyment in the process of the activity. So that sounds a bit a bit overwhelming and weird, but let me give you an example. So, have you ever felt like what you're doing just comes naturally? Like you do one thing, and immediately after accomplishing it, you already know what you want to do next, and don't waste any time in trying to figure out what to do next or how to do it. You just simply go straight into the next task and complete it. So that's exactly what the flow state of mind is. It is when work seems to flow like a river from one task to another, and eventually you get to what you want to achieve. That's exactly what the flow state of mind is. This happens when you're in the right state of mind, when you're relaxed and calm, and have all the prerequisite knowledge to do what it is you've set out to do. So most of the time, if you try to do something that you've done many times before, you're in the flow state of mind. You've done this many times before. You know what comes next. You know what to do. You're confident, and work seems to flow naturally. When you're in this flow state of mind, you can do a tremendous amount of work in much less time than it would take you to do it in a normal set of circumstances. So if you're constantly thinking about what to approach it, do you need anything to do what it is you've set out to do, that slows you down and ultimately curbs your productivity. So that's what the flow concept is essentially. It's a state of mind in which you become more productive and enjoy what you're doing. Getting in the flow state of mind is not easy, and I'm sorry to say it, but yeah, most of the time you're not going to be in the flow state of mind when you're programming, just because it's a really hard thing to do, and most of the time the work that you're doing is not following some kind of pattern, and it's most of the time requires you to figure out what to do next on your own. So it's not oftentimes that you're following a set of rules. Okay, so now that we've seen what the flow concept is and why it's so useful to us, let's see some tools we can use to help us get into such a state of mind. Um, let's have a look at what web tooling is and what web tools we can use. All right. So, web tooling um, refers to the process of setting up our development environment in such a way that boosts our productivity and enhances our performance in the day-to-day work or business or whatever. So, in a nutshell, this is the process where we choose the most appropriate software that we're most comfortable with and set it up in such a way that it works intuitively to us. As I said, this is a process. It's not some kind of you just do it once and then you're finished for the rest of, I don't know, the project or whatever. It's a process. So you find a tool, you experiment with it, and if it works for you, you decide to include it or not. You just simply leave it as it is. Um, the things that we use to get this process done are the web tools. And the web tools are the programs, or essentially the software, that helps us become more efficient and productive web developers. Um, it's important to be productive. I mean, I know that it's kind of obvious, but in a professional environment, you have deadlines as you do in this nanodegree. Fortunately, in this nanodegree, the deadlines are soft, so you can go beyond the deadline without it costing you anything. So that's a pretty fortunate thing because in the professional um, world, when we have web developers or any kind of developers actually skipping the deadlines, that usually ends up costing the company a lot of money. It gets users pretty angry. Products become delayed, so the firm's losing money. Employees get frustrated. Bosses get anxious, and clients ultimately get frustrated, which is the worst thing that can happen. So it's important to be productive to meet the deadlines. So the web tools automate some of the generic and repetitive setup we must go through in our day-to-day work. Essentially, web tools are like a handyman to us. It's sort of like having another person that manages our web development process. by just following the rules that we give it. Uh, so this handyman is actually a very smart man. We can just tell him what to do and what to do once only, and that set of instructions are always there for us when we need them done. So we give the command, and our handyman instantly gets to work and produces the exact same result each and every time we give out the command. So that's awesome, isn't it? Having such a handy tool um, at our hands at any time, which is predictable and um, can do the job. As a few examples of what we can do with web tools, so let me tell you a few examples. We can automatically compile, for example, our JavaScript code to accommodate older versions of browsers. So most likely you've now come across the ES6 version of the JavaScript language. Back in the day, so back in 2016 when it was released, um, the older browsers could not understand ES6, which meant that developers simply discarded this new version and continued writing the old ES5 version of the JavaScript language, which kind of um, renders the new version useless because if you know ES6 and implement it correctly in your code, there's no browser to understand what you're writing. So it's kind of it doesn't work. So why would you learn ES6 when you can't actually use it? Well, it turns out that one of the um, main things that we can use web tools for is to compile our JavaScript, so the JavaScript we write that's new to a much older version of JavaScript that is supported in all browsers, which actually is very helpful to us because um, after doing this compilation process by the web tools, we can accommodate older versions of the browsers. So people who haven't updated their browsers to the newest versions can actually view our sites, which means we can get more users to view what we've done. So that's a pretty useful thing. Another thing we can do with web tools is that we can launch our own local development server. So having a server available to us can demonstrate what the result of our code is, which is essential for us in writing good code. Another thing that we can do with web tools is that we can construct the file system in our project directory if we know what it will look like beforehand. We can also run a build process automatically. Um, a build process, it's something that you'll study a bit later in the nano degree towards the end. The build process is just converting all your um, project files into minified versions. So when the build process runs, it takes, for example, your JavaScript file. It comes out with a file that's, for example, I don't know, 5 times less lines of code that you've written. It looks very ugly, it's unreadable, but it's smaller in size and can be run faster in the browser in place of your old long lines of code file that you have. So that's another useful feature. If we had to manually do all this, we would spend a lot more time than we should. So there are many things that we can do with web tools um, that I haven't mentioned right here, but um, there are more. So you should know and you should check out on the web what you can do with web tools beyond what I mentioned already. So now that we know that web tools are awesome, I have listed three of the most famous web tools out there that are used by web developers. As you know, the choice of tools that you use in your project really depends on what you intend to do. So there's no universal setup that can be perfect for every project that we undertake, which is kind of, I don't know, tedious. Um, you have to decide for every project the appropriate tools, download them, set them up, and etc. But that's part of our job, so we should embrace it. You might be used to say a configuration of three tools, but you get a project that requires even more automation. So you might, for example, decide to add one or two more tools, or you might take up a project that requires very little automation and completely remove all the tools that you're using and do the setup manually. So the important thing to know here is that there is no right way to follow. There is no golden rule. There's no standards. It's all up to you, which can be a bit intimidating at first, especially when you're starting out. That's why you should experiment with different tools and different features to see what ultimately works for you. So, um, but for the projects that you're doing in the standard degree, apart from the last one, um, maybe you're not gonna be using any web tools like Gulp or SAS, Less, or all the others because there's really no need to automate any of the processes. It's all done manually, and it's good for you to practice doing this manually. So, and at a more later stage, when you really know what's going on, you can decide to include um, a tool that can automate the process and you understand what it actually does, which is important as well. So here, the three tools um, are the most popular that front-end developers use. They are SAS, Microsoft Visual Studio Code, and Gulp. The first one, SAS, SAS is an abbreviation which means syntactically awesome style sheets. Apart from having an awesome name, as you know, now this is a CSS preprocessor. What it does is that it takes the normal features of CSS and adds more functionality to the language, which allows us to essentially write less code to achieve the exact same thing. Especially in CSS, we often write needlessly repetitive code just to get an element to behave a certain way in a specific state. This, however, is not so when we use SAS. The improvement is dramatic, and I urge you to start using this library as soon as possible. It's worth to mention, though, that there are numerous other CSS processors as well, all of them having a different set of features that can be useful in different circumstances. So again, it all boils down to you and whatever you prefer, and also what the project requirements are. So SAS, I frequently use SAS on my own projects because it's just a dramatic improvement. Of course, To get the most out of SAS, you'll have to delve into something called CSS architecture. Um, yeah, CSS architecture is the way that you name your HTML elements, so what kind of classes you put on them, and following specific syntax, you can then style the elements and make it look intuitive, and overall the experience is better. So once you get the hang of SAS, definitely take a look at CSS architecture and choose the one that's most appropriate and it fits you best. And if you integrate that with SAS and HTML, the result can be really great. So the next tool that we're gonna take a look at is Microsoft Visual Studio Code. This is a code editor, a source code editor developed by Microsoft. Um, the other editors that you're probably used to now is Atom and Sublime Text. So if you're familiar with those, this is nothing new. It's just another option you have when choosing what you will use on your own projects. This editor has been around for 2 to 3 years now and has advanced massively. So it's older than Atom and Sublime Text. Um, uh, it's the new favorite actually, and is what I use as well. So definitely, I urge you to check it out, regardless of what editor you're using now. If you're using Atom or Sublime Text, take a look at this one. I think you'll like it as well. And if you do like it, you can start using it. Um, Again, it just comes down to what you prefer. No one is better. No one's actually faster or significantly faster. It's just up to you to choose whatever you want. And the last tool is Gulp. This is a tool that's built entirely on the JavaScript language. It's pretty well supported. It has a lot of features and has a large and dedicated community. Um, we'll speak about it in more detail in just a minute. So these are just three of the most widely used web tools out there. I highly urge you to check them out and see if you like any of them and possibly start using them. Now let's look at specific type of web tools called build tools. First up, let's actually explain what the process of building is. Build, or compilation, as it is otherwise called, is just a process. I have provided here a definition, so let's have a look at it. Build is the process of creating the application program for a software release by taking all the relevant source code files and compiling them, and then creating build artifacts such as binaries or executable program. Okay, so I find this definition a bit overwhelming at first. Let's go through the definition step by step. Here we can see the whole build process. Notice here it starts here with our source code. Um, this is the code that we type um, into our editors and save in files on our computer. This code is eligible to us, so we as humans understand the source code. We write it and we can easily understand what it means. However, this code makes absolutely no sense to our computer. The computer cannot understand what For example, document.querySelector means what a for loop does or anything like that. It doesn't understand CSS or HTML or whatever language for that matter. This is where the second um, part of this build process comes in. So here it is, the compiler. Um, the compiler is the program that takes our source code um, and runs complex procedures behind the scenes, which are not visible to us, and converts all that code into machine code. Now, what machine code is just zeros and ones. Just zeros and ones. If you see a sheet of machine code, it's just 0001111000101 and etc. This is what computers understand actually. And this is why they're so fast. There are just two things that they interpret: zeros, which stand for false, and ones, which stand for true. So booleans, true and false, are 0 and 1 respectively. So once the compiler compiles our code into machine code, this is the final step. Um, the computer interprets the machine code and the build process is complete. Note also that the machine code can be packaged into an executable file. Um, these are all the files with the .exe extension. These files allow you to run a program by simply double-clicking the icon. All it does is to unpack the machine code so the computer can interpret and run it. That's actually what all programs are made of. Um, it's either a sheet of machine code that's zeros and ones, or an executable file that is like a RAR file that unpackages a series of such files, and the computer runs them one after the other, and ultimately um, outputs some kind of um, program. So um, now that we know what the build process is, let's take a look at what build tools are and what they do. Build tools simply are programs that automate the creation of executable applications from source code. Building incorporates compiling. Like we said, building and compiling is essentially the same thing. Linking and packaging the code into a usable or executable form. So we talked about what executable is, and now you know. In small projects, developers will often manually invoke the build process. Okay, so in a nutshell, the build tools automate the build process. In large projects, the file structure is pretty complex. So for a nicely laid out website, so like Facebook or Twitter or whatever, you may have as many as 5 or 6 CSS files alone, not to mention the HTML files and the JavaScript and all the others that may exist in similar or even bigger numbers actually. Having this kind of file structure is a nightmare to manage, and running a build process manually on all these files in all this file structure is a nightmare. So running a build process manually would be next to impossible. Thanks to build tools, however, we can completely automate the build process and save ourselves a huge amount of time and work. Um, However, in small projects, like we discussed a bit earlier, where you have just 3 or 4 files, there's no need to use a build tool, because essentially what build tools are for is to automate a process to decrease the time of setup or running that we use on things that we would otherwise do manually. So if it takes more time for us to set up a build tool, or because they do require setting up, if it takes more time to do this than the time that we would manually run the build process, there's no reason to use a build tool in this kind of project because it will not give us any more time to work with than we would otherwise have. So just in general, when you have a small project, it's not worth to set up a build tool. You can just run the build process on your own. If you actually do decide to use a build tool for your project, here are some of the features that you should look for in a build tool in order for it to be actually useful to you in any way. Firstly, of course, it has to be fast. In this day and age, um, slow development software is virtually unusable, so we must also have a fast build tool. Nowadays, there aren't really any slow build tools. Although some are faster than others, it's up to you to do the research and pick the one you like most. So, again, it's up to you, all up to you. Next comes the community behind the build tool. It is uh, almost certain that during your interaction with the build tool, you're going to be frustrated that something's not working the way it should or the way you want. The documentation behind build tools and software in general is not always clear and concise, and the only option you have is to go online and see if anyone has ever had this issue before and how they have handled it and found a solution. This is why having a large community of developers use build tool and the build tool you're using is essential. So um, if you happen to run into a problem, if the build tool is used by a lot of people, chances are that somebody before you has run into the exact same problem and found a solution and it's ready for you to use, which is very handy, as I'm sure you've understood by now. So next, I think this one's pretty obvious. It should have many features out of the box. Um, In order for a build tool to be useful, as I said, it should really have a easy setup and a fast one as well. So once you have integrated it into your project, you should be able to immediately use it without much of a hassle. If you have to waste time downloading additional stuff to get it working, provide additional setup, that's not ideal by any means. And the next thing a build tool should do is that it should be easily extensible. You should be able to easily add or remove features from it at any time according to the needs of your project. And those are pretty much the bare minimum of things a build tool should be able to do. Nowadays, build tools have become quite sophisticated and you should have no problem with whichever one you choose. So let's actually see how the two most popular build tools today stack up next to one another. And here you have a bit of a disclaimer, a bit of a note. None of them is better than the other. Again, as I've said 1,000 times probably in this webinar, so sorry for repeating it, but I really want you to understand this. There is no right way, there is no right tool, there is no rules. You have to set up your own process, your own tools, and make your own decisions. So Grunt is the first build tool that we're gonna take a look at. So Grunt was the first build tool to be massively used by web developers and other developers out there in professional projects. It's pretty well developed, has many features, and a large plugin ecosystem. However, the most important thing about it is, um, and actually what it sets it apart from the other build tool that we'll look at, is that it emphasizes configuration over code. This means that we can't write code to configure grunt. We must do manual setup to make it do what we want, which is actually kind of restricting. So the main thing that you'll want to take away from this is that it focuses on configuration over code. The other things are very important as well, uh, as having a strong community. So you'll you'll not waste too much time figuring out what the problem is that you're facing with Grunt. It has a large plugin ecosystem, so it has many additional functionality you can use. And it's another important thing that we should mention about Grunt is that it executes tasks one after the other. So it's kind of a sequence. Things happen in consequence to one another. One task runs, and once it finishes, the next one starts. And that's, in a nutshell, the characteristics of Grunt. Now let's take a look at what Gulp has to offer us. Just like Grunt, Gulp offers us a big community of developers, so we can find help online for any problems we might run into. There is also a large plugin ecosystem. It's also fast and feature rich out of the box. However, the big difference and the reason why in recent years it has become more widely used than Grunt is that it is focused on code rather than configuration. Remember, it's the other way around in Grunt. So Gulp is much more adaptable than Grunt, and all we have to know to be able to configure it is JavaScript. We just make use of Gulp's API and our JavaScript knowledge to set up our build tool. That's very neat and allows us much more freedom than what we have in Grunt. Also, another advantage is that Gulp can execute multiple tasks at once, whereas Grunt does them sequentially. Remember, we mentioned that um, in Grunt, one task runs, and only once it's finished, the next one starts. It's not like this in Gulp, however. Things run parallel, and that makes Gulp actually a bit more faster than Grunt. Ultimately, though, the difference is not that huge. People still use Grunt. Um, it's again up to you to decide which is best for you. Right now, however, we'll explore only Gulp and leave all the others for another time. But definitely do check them out though. Okay, so here I have listed a few tips from my personal practice that I think are related to build tools, and um, are very useful to know as a developer, regardless of what kind of development you're working in. So, in the beginning, I had a lot of trouble with these build tools. The build process, I didn't really know what it was. All these npm packages, I didn't know what Node.js did. Um, and it took a fairly large amount of time before I really figured out what all these npm packages were, how am I supposed to use them, and what do they actually bring. So um, as you build more and more complex projects, you will notice that there are readily available libraries out there built by developers that make your life much easier, and you start to wonder whether you should use them in your project. So, such examples are, one of them that we mentioned earlier is SAS. I mean, you can use them in every project, but you shouldn't. I mean, it's no use including them in some small projects because the benefit that you'll get is offset by the additional resources that you're going to have to load up in order for it to get working. Another example of a library is jQuery. So um, jQuery is an awesome library, but it's not useful in every single case. So you should definitely think out your project beforehand if you want to um, optimize it the best way you can. So since there is no rules set that describe when exactly you should use an external library, I thought I'd share my personal experience and help you find a bit of guidance that I wish I could when I was starting out, like you. Now, bear in mind that these are only 4 tips. There is much, much more to learn later on, as I'm sure you will find out when you're developing a bit more complex projects. So first and foremost, while you're still learning the basics of the world of web development, it's best to trust the more experienced seniors and not to build your own libraries. You absolutely can, but I don't recommend doing it unless you really know what you're doing, because things can get a bit out of hand really quickly. You can break a lot of things in your code and generally waste a lot of time that you can use on otherwise more important matters. So, um, having your own personal external library is something really awesome and something that you should definitely do, but just take caution. And in this early stage of your encounter with web development, I would advise you to delay this for a bit later when you're more experienced and you know how things go and you really need this. So the second thing that we will discuss, so the second tip is to use commonly accepted libraries like jQuery, SAS, less, React, and all the others. That way, if you find a bug or don't know how to use a feature, you'll find plenty of resources online that tackle the problem at hand. That's like the feature of the build tools that we discussed earlier. So, having a strong community behind the package, the library, or the tool is beneficial in every single case. So, thirdly, and this one's actually very important, run away from packages and libraries that claim to do it all. Sadly, this is completely impossible. Most projects depend on tens of thousands of external libraries, so having one library do it all is just not impossible. Um, so if you decide to include something like this library that claims to do it all, it will most likely either not do it all like it claims, or if it does actually turn out to do it all, you'll most probably not need like 70% of its functionality, and will end up sacrificing any gains that you've had for the time that you're gonna spend loading the package or the external library. So it's best to put these libraries that um, claim to be everything aside. And last but not least, do not over optimize. Including a library makes your project's success depend on this specific library, and external resources are not maintained by you. That's why they're called external. There might be a huge update, for example, or even a small update to this external library, and that modifies a part of its code that you're using, and uh, this might cause the place that you're using this external library in your own code to break. So that might lead to disastrous consequences. It might even break your whole app. And the worst thing about it is that um, you will not get any notification of it. The link that's the place where you link the external library is just gonna reference another new actually version of this external library, and this new version will modify your existing code and destroy everything, and leave you with tears in your eyes. So definitely only include external library or npm package only when you need to. Okay, so now that we know these handy tips, let's get ourselves acquainted with Gulp. Well, not so fast actually. Before installing Gulp, you'll have to dust off the skills of the good old terminal. We will be making use of the terminal, so it's essential to be able to work with it and its basic commands. Those commands include the cd command, which we use for navigating in the file structure. Um, so, for example, if we want to go to a place on our D drive called programming, for example, we type in cd and then programming, and we enter that directory. If we want to go back, we just type cd followed by two dots. Um, if you're on a Mac, you'll have to research what commands are used on the Mac OS. I think most of them are pretty similar, but there are some of them that are different. So definitely check that out if you're on a Mac. The dir command, when you're in a directory, it just lists all the folders and their names. That's all it does. So if you want to find out what kind of files are in the specific directory you're at the moment, you just type out dir, hit enter, and those are shown. The third one I have listed here is the touch command. The touch command creates a new file in the current directory. So you have to specify what the name of the file is and its extension. So if you want to create a text file, you would type out the name. So for example, gulp.text. And you should place touch before that. And once you hit enter, you have the new file in the file structure. So those are some of the most basic commands. You have the ls commands, the mkdir commands, and etc. So definitely check those out and make sure you get a bit of practice with those because installing anything um, like Node.js or npm, Gulp will involve a bit of usage on the command line, and it's generally great to know the command line in your own development. So definitely do that. Okay, so once we know how to interact with the command line, we can now see the steps that we have to take to install and get Gulp running on our computer. First up, as you can see, we have to install Node.js. We will use its package manager called npm to install the Gulp package on our machine. Whenever you install Node and npm, you should run the npm-v command in the terminal to check if you've successfully done that. There, so there npm-v, you open the terminal, type npm-v, and if you get some kind of version displayed to you, that means that you have Node and npm successfully installed on your machine. Secondly, we use this command, so npm I, which stands for install -g, which stands for global. So we place gulp -cli after that. So once we run this command, we install gulp, the gulp command line interface on our system. So CLI here stands for command line interface. Once we do that, we install Gulp globally on our computer. Um, Thirdly, we have to create a directory for our project. So and navigate to it using the command line or the command prompt if you're on Windows. Um, Next, we have to create a package.json file using our Node package manager. We just type in simply npm init. This is the command that we use for that. What the package.json file is the file that we use to list the dependencies of our project and the scripts that we can run for it. So now that we have created our package.json file, we can add dependencies to our project. And the dependency we have to get for Gulp is this command, npm install again savedev gulp. Here, savedev refers to save as a developer dependency. So once we do that, we have integrated Gulp into our project and we can get to work on setting it up. The next step, is to write the tasks that, or actually first up, is to check the installation status of Gulp. So we type in that gulp-v, and if we get returned some kind of version, that means that we've done the setup process correctly. And the next step is to write the tasks that we want Gulp to automate. So we do this in the previously created gulp file.js. This is the place where we will write all the tasks that we want Gulp to run. And finally, once we've listed all the instructions to Gulp, we can use the Gulp command in the command line to test out the code that we've written, and hopefully we get the desired results. If not, we will simply make the needed corrections to the Gulp file and we're good to go. And that's actually it. It's not that hard to use Gulp. Especially once you've done it a few times, you'll quickly get the hang of it. Now let's see the resources. I think will be useful to you if you want to further study the topics. Um, the first link is an article that explains the role of flow in web design. So if you're not that much into web design, don't worry. It barely mentions web design at all. This is more of a general view on the flow concepts. So next, we have the Node.js homepage. There you will find useful tips on how to get started with Node.js and npm. Also, that's where you'll find the link for downloading Node. Next up, we have the Gulp.js quick start guide. This is a step-by-step guide on how to get Gulp working as quick as possible on your own machine. Also, it has resources for its functionality that you might want to check out. And finally, the Gulp.js homepage, which where you can get tips on how to work with Gulp more efficiently. And that's actually it for the topic. Um, I hope you've learned some new interesting things and got something useful out of today's webinar. Um, I hope that um, you get enough inspiration to finish the third project, so the arcade game, on time. Remember that if you have any difficulty with it, and you can't find a solution on your own, I'm here at all times, so by no means should you be intimidated to ask me anything. I'm always happy to help you. I'll be cheering for you, and hopefully, you'll get the third project done on time. Next week, we'll have another webinar. A bit more details on that will follow on Monday, and I wish you endless inspiration. Good luck with the coding, and see you next time. Thank you for watching.